Good morning again, everybody. I am Doug Carlson. I work for TDA Consulting. I'm assisted by Stan Fitterman from Fitterman Consulting Group and Dan Schmutzler from the Office of Block Grant Assistance. This is the CDBG-CV session for broadband. We're going to go over multiple topics today, so hopefully everybody can ask questions in the Q&A. We'll talk about that in a second and get your questions answered before we're done with the session today. So just quickly, these are some of the things that we're going to talk about during our hour together today. We're going to talk a little bit about the background on broadband with CDBG and broadband in general in terms of its need. We're going to talk about the applicability of using CDBG-CV for broadband. Much of what we're going to talk about today is going to be related to the CDBG for broadband, CDBG-CV for broadband quick guide, which is posted on the HUD Exchange and is linked in this presentation. The presentation slides will be sent to all the participants a day or two after the session. So expect to get these presentation slides as well. So what are we going to talk about today with respect to broadband? Well, we've got a lot of things to talk about, but we're going to focus on two main topics. The first topic is the eligibility of CDBG activities to support broadband. And of course, we're focusing on CV, but regular CDBG could be used for broadband support as well. But we're going to focus mostly on CDBG-CV. We're going to talk about the use of it for infrastructure, for the emergency payments that are allowed under the Federal Register Notice for CDBG-CV, and in general for CDBG, for using broadband for housing activities, using broadband with respect to an economic development block grant activity under public services. As part of public services, we're going to talk a little bit about how you do digital training and learning with broadband and how you can qualify that as a public service. And then last but not least, we're going to talk a little bit about planning and admin with respect to how you categorize that with CDBG-CV. The second part of the session, which Stan will do, is going to discuss how you meet a national objective for broadband activities. So all CDBG-CV activities have to meet a two-part test. They have to meet the eligibility criteria in the CDBG regulations, and they have to meet a national objective. So Stan is going to go over the national objectives as they relate to broadband activities, including area of benefit, limited clientele, presumed benefit, and urgent need. Stan also has a couple of really great broadband models that he's going to present to you to give you some idea of how other jurisdictions, states, and cities are using CDBG for broadband. And then also we're going to have some Q&As again at the end of the session. We encourage you to use the Q&A box for your questions rather than the chat. Please feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself in general or to chat amongst yourselves, but use the Q&A for any questions that you want to have answered, because we will try to get to as many of them or all of them if we can at the end of the session when we're done presenting. So if we just stick with that Q&A box, it makes it a little bit easier for us to get through the session and to actually get to your questions. So thanks for doing that. So let's go into the background around broadband in general and CDBG for broadband. One of the things that we know from multiple studies that have been done is that there are pretty significant gaps in internet connectivity for low and moderate income households and for elderly persons. We know that those gaps can lead to gaps in income and earned income and education gaps for school-age children. We know that because of the pandemic, there has been a huge increase in remote work situations. There have been and still are classes that are remote, that are not in the classroom. And then there's also been a huge increase in telehealth services as a result of the pandemic. So those are really coming to fruition and showing the obvious gaps in broadband connectivity that some households have. There are also differences in the access to broadband equipment and other types of and Wi-Fi and other connectivity that makes it really difficult. You can talk about internet speeds and those kinds of things for low and moderate income households and elderly persons and others, that makes it really difficult for them to work in the environment that we're in, the technological environment that we're in right now. And one of the areas that really lacks connectivity are rural areas. Rural areas tend to not have the infrastructure for broadband, in any way, and they really are suffering in terms of access to remote learning, access to jobs to some degree in other areas, and of course, health services and other things. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation today. That link that you see in that slide is actually to an article about a Michigan State University study that talked about the lack of connectivity in rural areas and how they're suffering because of it as a result of the pandemic. So that's a link that's actually there in the slide. It's also important to remember that broadband for several years now should be part of the overall strategy for CDBG funding, and it can be part of the overall strategy for CDBG-CV funding. CPD Notice 20-04, which came out last year, actually discusses how consideration of broadband needs for LMI households and discussions with service providers, internet service providers, and others supporting broadband should actually be part of the consolidated plan that is done by jurisdictions. And then remember also that the CDBG regulations apply to any broadband activities, as do the flexibilities and alternative requirements that are in the Federal Register Notice for CDBG-CV, which is linked again in this session in that slide right there. Last but certainly not least, we have to remember with everything related to CDBG-CV that no duplication of benefits can occur. We cannot pay twice for the same thing. That's the easiest way that I can explain duplication of benefits. You have to make sure that you look at all federal resources and non-federal resources when it comes to supporting broadband activities, and make sure that there is no duplication of benefit in terms of the assistance that is provided for that broadband activity from more than one source. So when we think about how we qualify an activity for broadband activity under CDBG-CV, there are several things that we want to think about. There's a lot of ways actually that you can use CDBG-CV funds to enhance broadband access. And in order to do that, just like with any CDBG activity, you need to have the documentation necessary to qualify those activities under eligibility and national objectives. And one other consideration, which I'm going to get to in just a second. One of the factors, of course, is cost considerations. There is a wide varying range of costs for everything from equipment to infrastructure development and other connectivity and operating costs that grantees should consider when they think about funding activities for broadband. They can be very expensive or actually can be very cost efficient depending upon how you carry out the activities. So learning about how broadband connectivity is done, the ways that it can be done in different types of projects, whether it's infrastructure or housing or something else, or even services, how do you get to that point and how do you think about the costs related to it is something that all grantees should consider, since the funds are limited with both regular CDBG and CDBG-CV. Beyond eligibility and national objectives, there is the prepare, prevent, and respond to coronavirus tieback that is needed for all CDBG-CV funds. Every activity must demonstrate a connection to the coronavirus in one way or another. That is a requirement. That's a third requirement, if you will, for CDBG-CV funding. And there is a quick guide that was developed to kind of help grantees understand how you meet that PPR tieback. We call it the PPR tieback to make it easier to say. But that quick guide actually gives multiple examples of how grantees can meet the tieback to CDBG-CV funding to the coronavirus across a pretty wide range of activities, including the ones that we're going to talk about in a few minutes today. So there's a link again in this slide to that quick guide so that if you don't have it, you can access it and read the content that is in the quick guide. So I'm going to go over some of the elements of what are the categories of eligible activities for the most part, not all of them, of course, but the category of eligible activities that can be used and are often used to support broadband activities. And there are several that I'm going to go through. And then after I go through this category of eligible activities, we will actually stop for your questions around eligibility, because that's usually a topic that generates a lot of questions. So we will stop at the end of that section on eligible activities that I'm going to do before Stan goes into his section on national objectives, and answer any questions that you have about eligibility with respect to CDBG-CV for broadband. So infrastructure, lots of folks are familiar with infrastructure. We do it all the time with CDBG in different ways. We think a lot of streets and sidewalks and other types of activities that are done with respect to public infrastructure and private infrastructure, but it certainly could include broadband as well. So infrastructure activities for broadband with CDBG-CV could include the first bullet items: wiring, fiber optic cables, other permanently affixed equipment that helps broadband access capability in a community or in a housing development or some other type of project, a public facility, something similar to that. Infrastructure to facilities and in the public sense are eligible under 24 CFR 201C. And then for state program, it is the link to, or the law for the state program is also noted under 42 USC. So those are both eligible infrastructure activities. For broadband, you can do acquisition, construction, rehabilitation, reconstruction, and distribution lines and facilities for both public and privately owned utilities. Publicly owned utilities with some exceptions. There's another guide on that that is on the HUD Exchange with respect to how you fund public utilities with CDBG-CV. But it is an eligible activity under 201I. For privately owned utilities as well as for publicly owned utilities, or I'm sorry, I think that's 201L. So infrastructure can be done with CDBG-V with respect to broadband support. So that can be done as part of your activities. The next category that's popular in other respects for rental use assistance and utility assistance is the emergency payments category. Emergency payments are typically ineligible under CDBG, but there is an exception for payments to support families that are in crisis and need an emergency payment of some kind or another. So those types of emergency payments can be used to make utility expenses for families, and that would include internet service, right? Provided that there's a utility bill from an internet service provider, you can make an emergency payment to families as part of that category of funding with CDBG-CV. And it's important to remember that the emergency payments provision, which is typically 3 months under CDBG, has been extended to 6 months under CDBG-CV under the Federal Register notice. So that's for CDBG-CV funds and any 2019 or 2020 formula funds that are used to prepare, prevent, or respond to coronavirus. So it's also important to remember if you're making emergency payments, whether it's for internet service or utilities or rent, in fact, that there is, again, another FAQ that's on the HUD Exchange, which is linked in this slide that was published on March 30th that talks about how you make subsistence type payments or emergency payments and deal with folks who are in arrearages. It's important to remember that the payment period begins when the payment is made, not when somebody is due back utility expenses or rent expenses. You can cover within the first month of assistance, you can cover the back rent, back utility expenses, including internet service for a family in the first month of assistance, and then continue through the remaining 6 months of consecutive assistance under emergency payments. So this can include, again, internet service for a family, for a household that needs an emergency payment assistance. So remember also the last caveat around emergency payments is that these payments cannot be made directly to the low and moderate income household. That's an income payment, that's ineligible under CDBG. They have to be made directly to the internet service provider on behalf of the low and moderate income household. The next category of eligible activities that applies quite a bit, actually, in some respects to broadband are housing activities. So HUD actually, in its definitions under some prior Federal Register notice, actually included a definition for broadband for housing. And that definition is, as you note there, cables, fiber optics wire, or other permanent infrastructure, including wireless infrastructure. So that's actually HUD's definition of how you do broadband access for housing activities. And CDBG funds can be used to do rehab of single and multifamily privately owned buildings, as everybody I think knows, for residential purposes, and also for nonprofit, CDC or other organization-owned non-residential buildings and improvements. Those are all eligible under 24 CFR 570-202. So as part of that, you can do broadband infrastructure or wireless connectivity or other types of activities that are related to that housing project that help increase access to broadband for low and moderate income households. It's also important to know that there is an added section now to 57202 that actually requires the installation of broadband infrastructure if a building has more than 4 rental units and is being substantially rehabilitated as it's defined under 24 CFR Part 5. So there's actually a requirement in some instances that broadband infrastructure be supplied as part of a housing activity. So it's important to keep that in mind, and you might want to look up that regulation if you're not familiar with it. Last but not least, if new housing construction is being done, which is typically ineligible with CDBG, but if it's carried out under certain circumstances by a community development organization, then you can do new housing construction, and that new housing construction could include broadband installation as part of that activity. So the next category of activities, again, and there's a quick guide related to this for CDBG-CV, is economic development. This is another topic that is pretty hot right now with respect to CDBG-CV. How do we help the economy in our community as a result of the pandemic? And CDBG-CV funds can, of course, be used to provide grants or loans to nonprofit or for-profit businesses, including businesses that focus on broadband and internet access and technology. So you can provide working capital assistance, grants or loans, or other types of assistance to a business as you normally would under 57203B. That can include companies that do some form of technology as part of their business, and under job creation and retention would be able to hire or retain employees as part of that assistance from the community. It's important to remember that if you do any form of economic development activity, that you need to follow the underwriting standards that are in the CDBG regulations, and those must be applied to all special economic development activities. And again, there is, again, another quick guide on how you use CDBG-CV for economic development that is on the HUD Exchange. That quick guide is posted on this slide, so you'll have access to it when you get the slides. It's also important to know, in terms of using this as an eligible activity, that there are waivers and flexibilities in the Federal Register notice for CDBG-CV for economic development activities. Stan is going to go over a couple of those. One of those, for example, is that the aggregate public benefit standard is waived under CDBG-CV if it's used for economic development activities, amongst some other flexibilities that are provided in that notice. And it's important to know what those flexibilities are when you're carrying out an activity and trying to meet a national objective. And as I said, Stan will go over that a little bit later in his presentation. So one of the more important areas of broadband access that could be eligible under CDBG-CV is public services. And there are lots and lots of different examples of how you can use CDBG-CV to support public services that connect people to broadband in one way or another. Public services in the CDBG regulations, they're an eligible activity under 57201E. And when you're carrying out a public service related to broadband with CDBG-CV, they could include digital learning classes, after-school programs, which have become extremely popular and necessary for learning objectives for school-age children. There are obviously telehealth services and other types of programs and services that people need access to. Even now, as we're kind of coming out to some degree of the pandemic, there's still a huge need for these types of services. And if those are carried out by a subrecipient, for example, those could be eligible under CDBG-CV. And there's lots of different ways, including training and other types of support that help people build their skill set that I'll talk about just a little bit more here in a second, that could be eligible under CDBG-CV. Remember that with public services, part of carrying out a public services could be the purchase of equipment that is related to that public service. So if you think about some form of connectivity devices, laptops, other types of things, those can be purchased as part of the public service and part of the eligible activity, those are eligible. So it's important, however, if you're purchasing converter devices or laptops or other types of equipment for connectivity, that you have to follow the equipment management and disposition requirements at 2 CFR 200. There are multiple regulations related to equipment and disposition of equipment in 2 CFR 200, but it's important to remember that you have to follow those if you're going to buy equipment to carry out broadband activities with CDBG-CV. It's also important to remember that in the cases where those items of equipment have a current fair market value that is $5,000 or less, that equipment can be retained, sold, or otherwise disposed of by a grantee with no further obligation to HUD. So one of the examples in the CDBG for Broadband Quick Guide is if you had laptops for an after-school program, for example, and those laptops were less than $5,000 each, you could collect those at the end of the program. You could retain them to have the program start up again at a later date. You could use them for another eligible purpose. Or if you wanted to, for some reason, you could dispose of that equipment, provided that they meet the benchmark of being $5,000 or less. So it is possible to buy equipment and provide services and then retain that equipment and use it again for a service at a later date. So under public services, one of the categories that is really important and is becoming more and more important to people all the time as part of a public service is digital training and education. So this is discussed a lot in the Connect Home guidebook, which we will link and send to you later. Connect Home is a program that's been around since about 2015, which is trying to enhance broadband service and connectivity in HUD-assisted households. As part of that, there's the push for digital training and education. There are multiple examples in the Connect Home guidebook on how you can do that. And that has been going on in HUD-assisted housing for about 5 years now. So it can also be part of a CDBG-CV public service. So there's lots of digital training and education components that can be assisted as part of a public service. And it can range from some of the most basic connectivity and broadband knowledge and learning activities that you can think of to some of the more advanced things as part of a technical skills training program. Many people are not fluid in digital learning. They don't understand a lot of the connectivity issues related to digital learning or digital telehealth or other types of things. So increasing people's digital fluency could be part of that public service. There are ways to increase people's technical skills around connectivity and technology. And for school-age children in particular, if you're providing access to online instructional materials and classes, you're helping bridging the tech gap for low and moderate income students, which is a very real thing. And again, has been studied multiple times. And we know that because of bandwidth speeds or not even access to equipment or technology in one way or another, there are many students that are falling behind when classes are conducted online. Doing training and education, and I know from many years ago, just trying to learn all of the explosion in tech that came out over the last couple of decades, it also builds your confidence. It takes a while to learn some of these skills, but using it as a public service to increase training and education is really important. And it can be, again, part of an eligible public service. So last but certainly not least, there are some ways that you can use CDBG-CV for broadband under the planning and administration part of the CDBG program. There are ways to do planning for broadband service, to do the resource mapping of where broadband is available, where it's not available, how connectivity can be improved. There are financing strategies that could be part of an overall plan. There could even be utility plans and other types of planning activities related to broadband that would be considered eligible activities under CDBG-CV. Those categories of eligibility are 24 CFR 570-205 and the state law site that you see in the slide. So you can do some planning activities related to broadband with CDBG-CV, but it's important to remember, just like with all of the other eligible activities categories that I have gone through, that you have to have the PPR tied back for planning activities as well. In other words, you have to justify the need for the planning activity with respect to your approach to responding to, preparing for, preventing coronavirus. So remember that if you're thinking about any kind of planning activity with CDBG-CV funds. So the next section is going to be on national objectives, but I'm going to stop and see if we have some questions. Diane is going to help us kind of categorize some of these before we get into national objectives. I know that eligibility can be an area where people have lots of questions. We're going to take a pause and see if there are any questions related to eligibility.
Right. So yes, we have gotten some questions related to eligibility. So some of these are asking how CDBG-CV can be used to pay for broadband service. And well, let's just start there if you wanted to expand or just feel like we've covered that.
Stan, you want to take that?
Oh, well, sure. I mean, it is a utility, and I think in Doug and some of the previous slides, the emergency assistance payments can be used to cover the cost of utilities, including the cost of broadband. You've got that limitation of the 6 consecutive months, so payments can only be made during that time frame. But that would be how you would pay for it.
And I think you're going to, in order to make those payments, you need that. We all get a Comcast bill. We all get a bill from somebody. So if you're assisting a family, you want to actually, of course, do some record keeping around those that assistance and make sure that you know what the expenses are that are incurred by the low and moderate income household. And that's usually verified by, right, their bill from their internet service provider. So make sure that you have that and use that as a way to document the need. Right, and also to make sure that you're adequately accounting for the cost and making sure that you're not paying more than you should for that service.
And that you pay the provider directly.
And you pay the provider, you do not pay the family directly. Thank you. Yep, exactly.
Right. Okay, so there's a couple of very specific questions related to eligible uses and covering services. So can you cover internet service, including internet hotspots or also cellular data plans? And in addition, another question relates it back to, can we pay for non-service fees, such as payments for appliances that are included in the power bill?
So that's a tough one. I know that broadband service is considered to some degree a utility expense. Cell service, on the other hand, is another story. I don't personally know how much that is covered or been addressed in any of the Q&As or AAQ. Do you know, Stan?
I have not seen that, no.
I mean, I think that's a good AAQ question or a good question that we can raise up to HUD, but that question has come up before. I know that some grantees, just in order to kind of draw the line, for lack of a better way to put it, have kind of said that there are lots of different ways for people to get support around cell phone and mobile phone usage, and that the internet service is kind of where the line is drawn as a utility under the emergency payments provision. So we don't know that for sure, but that question has come up before. And we'll try to get feedback to people on that. And it's also an AAQ question that could be asked, by the way, in the CDBG-CV AAQ.
Yeah.
And for the hotspot issue, you potentially have a national objective problem, but Escambia County, Florida, which is Pensacola, so in the Panhandle, they installed hotspots at some parks that were in low mod areas so that folks could have access, usually by driving to the park and sitting in the parking lot, but folks around the park as well would have access to internet. So it can be done as long as you can get through your national objective issue.
Right, and I think it's important to remember that hotspots as part of a public service or carried out as part of an activity like a public service that meets a national objective, where you have control over those hotspots, is a little different than providing a hotspot to a family directly, right? So remember, the emergency payments provisions deals with rent, utilities, and other emergency expenses that are needed by a family in order to stay in their housing or to pay their bills, not be evicted, or have some other issues, right? So that's a little bit different than buying a piece of equipment for somebody individually, right? There is some pretty big distinctions there between that and buying hotspots to carry out a public service. You can definitely buy equipment to carry out a public service. We covered that in the slide under public services. But if you're thinking about buying things for a family, that is a lot different than paying a a bill that is owed by a family as part of the emergency payments provision. And Stan, do you agree with that? That's just kind of my
and we're going to talk a little later about an example in Tucson that was providing internet service to individuals. We're going to make that distinction.
Right. All right, so another part with that question was, for utility assistant, can you pay for non-service fees, like payments for appliances that are included in the power bill?
My understanding is yes, that it's really what all of the cost of providing the service, and then would include the equipment as well, right? So when you get a bill, you get a bill for all of it. You could pay for the cost of providing that service, which means you have to have the equipment to have the service. So I believe that the equipment charges as part of that utility bill would be eligible.
Okay. An additional clarification question from what you just talked about. Can CDBG-CV funds be used for the purchase of devices for residents to keep?
I think we just covered that. I would stay away from buying devices for individuals. Again, when we talk about buying equipment, we typically talk about it under public services as an eligible cost for carrying out the public service. So that is a little bit different than using the emergency payments provision to help with somebody's internet bill or their rent or some other type of utility bill, like their power bill, their gas bill, those types of things. I personally would stay away from buying equipment for individuals.
But I'll add, if you are providing a service such as internet service to low-income clientele, low-income households, and they need a device to be able to access your Wi-Fi, then as Doug mentioned, that's part of delivering the service. That equipment is the part of delivering that service. Right. And then it would be eligible.
Right. I think part of the distinction here is what type of activity you're carrying out. Are you carrying out a public service, or are you trying to make emergency payments for a family in some way or another under the provision? It's important to remember that emergency payments, 57207 actually says that income payments are ineligible under CDBG. And that's actually in the law, but there is the exception for emergency payments. So if I'm a grantee, I'm going to look at that very carefully and be very careful about how I make emergency payments, because that is typically not something we do with CDBG. And it's important to make sure that you kind of stay within the lines on emergency payments, in my opinion. But that is different than buying equipment to carry out a public service.
Right. Okay. Yeah, and it's always, remember, whatever you do, document it.
Yes.
Tie back. So
yes, and tie back, exactly.
That's right. And that'll help you out too. Another question on eligible uses is, can you explain a little bit more about what a digital literacy class is and provide a specific example of a digital literacy class?
Sure. I mean, I can do the best that I can. Imagine that you have a subrecipient. It could even be a nonprofit that kind of helps people with learning in one way or another, that kind of talks about, believe it or not, there are people who aren't fluent in the digital world, right? So you could talk about everything from how you could use a laptop, how you connect to the internet, how you use it to look for different types of things in terms of searches. You could use it to teach people how to use different pieces of technology, right? Whether it's computers or anything else, you can teach them how to get access to information that's available on the internet. I can tell you from personal experience that I have an 83-year-old father-in-law who is doing telehealth, and my wife has gone over to his house and helped him access the telehealth services multiple times because it's a challenge for him. And if he had some type of learning program, a public service for elderly folks that would be carried out that would help him kind of learn the basic skills in order to access his telehealth services, that would be an example of digital learning or training. And of course, there are lots of ways you can teach young people, although they're very savvy nowadays, of course. But there are other ways that you can teach young people who are behind in one way or another to have the kind of skills that other students have that may have had access to pads or laptops or other types of technology before them because their family wasn't able to buy it. So I think there's lots of ways to do digital learning, and I'm no expert on it. But again, the Connect Home playbook, which we're going to send you as part of the link to this session, has a lot of examples in there of how that's being done already or has been done in HUD-assisted housing. So that'll be provided to you with these slides.
Okay, thank you. We got a couple more questions I want to get to, and then we can go back to the presentation. This is related to more of the eligible activities related to infrastructure and actually working with service providers. So the first question is in relation to broadband infrastructure development. How can CDBG be used on development that's owned by a private broadband provider? For example, if the lines are going to be put in the ground, they're going to be owned by the service provider, not publicly owned. Is that something that would be eligible, and how?
Usually, and I'll let Doug weigh in too, but the way I've seen this work is that the grantee will lease the space on the fiber optics, on the broadband, to the ISP, to the internet service providers. And the fee is usually based on how much bandwidth. So that's the extent of my knowledge. So I will not be taking any follow-up questions on that. But that's my understanding of one way it works. Other ways that that some folks have done it is they continue to own the service. They own the lines and they provide the service. My understanding is there are some states where that's not legal. And so you would need to make sure you follow state law, but that's the other way that I've seen that done as well. Doug, I'll let you.
No, I think you've got it. And I know Stan has personal experience with this because he was a developer of affordable housing. So he kind of knows what it's like to have fun with service providers in terms of kind of building that broadband infrastructure.
Yeah, we hired a consultant. That's how we have fun.
Yeah. I think it's also a good question if you want to send for AAQ if you have a specific situation, since it varies so much from state to state and how these types of ownership is structured. So
yeah, we do acknowledge and understand the fact that different internet service providers are, you know, they want to own the cables, they want to own the infrastructure, they want to own everything related to it. We know how tricky that can be. It can be done, but leasing is a good example of how you can do that. But basically, it's negotiation when it comes to putting that infrastructure in with the ISP.
So here's a little bit of a twist off of that subject. And just opening it up for you guys, do you have examples of any successes or what the success has been with other grantees in their communication with their local broadband providers and working with them?
My experiences with West Virginia, I don't know if anybody from West Virginia is on and wants to weigh in, but they've done a lot of work on expanding broadband to areas, especially given as a state, they have a lot of areas that are predominantly low mod. And they have either had some of the municipalities implement it themselves, or they have done the leasing part. And they have actually put out a manual that if you Google West Virginia CDBG broadband, you'll find their manual of how they kind of have structured some of their programs throughout the state.
And Stan's got a couple examples at the end of his presentation on national objectives, including West Virginia. And we will try to link that. I think I saw that at one time. We'll try to link that guide.
That document. Okay.
Yeah. Because I think that would be a good resource for people to have.
Okay. Great. Was reading a question that just came in. So just a little clarification is being requested on what we just talked about. If the regulations allow for assistance to private utilities, what do units of local governments need to be concerned with in providing assistance to broadband providers? And in the case that this questioner is mentioning is that the UGLA just doesn't want to lease.
It's going to be tough, Doug. I think that, since I'm talking national objectives, I'll start there. I think you might have national objective problems, potentially, if they're not serving a low mod area. I think you have potential problems if they want to charge market rate. And so you've installed something to benefit them and it's no benefits going to our low mod households. So I think that gets hard.
Yeah, I think it does get hard. And I think that you have to have a provider that's willing to play ball, for lack of a better way to put it. You know, they have to have an incentive for some reason to be able to help you assist those households, because in the end, you've got to meet that national objective. And so that's always cumbersome and difficult. I mean, there will be an example later again of how jurisdiction kind of used, did it themselves. In other words, like they kind of provided some infrastructure publicly rather than kind of dealing with it privately. And Stan will talk about that at the end of the presentation, but there are some jurisdictions that have actually tried to increase connectivity in their own facilities, right? They've created hotspots or other types of areas where people, for libraries, public facilities of other kinds, where they can create connectivity. With housing, it's very difficult, right? Because you need to have the infrastructure available from the provider. And then you have to deal with the issue of whether it's in the public right of way or whether it's a private utility and all of those things. But you have to have somebody who's willing to work with you in order to provide that connectivity. That's just the bottom line, especially for housing projects.
Great. All right. I said the last one's the last one, but this one's a good one. And it just into what about cooperatives that are publicly owned? Would the ownership of the infrastructure be similar to water and sewer infrastructure owned by a utility district?
Very possibly, but the devil's in the details, in terms of the structure of the publicly owned co-op, who's the board, how is it structured, how is it classified under the state? Is it a nonprofit? Is it not a nonprofit? There's a bunch of things that would have to be considered with respect to that. I mean, it's potentially could be a public facility type of project with a co-op, but the devil's in the details with these types of activities. You really need to drill down and make sure you know exactly what the co-op structure is.
Okay.
But it's got potential.
It's got potential, yeah.
Yeah.
Co-ops are used in many ways, not just for this type of activity, but certainly for other types of utilities like electricity. They're used quite often.
Great. All right. So I want to let you guys get back to the presentation so we can cover it. There are a few more questions in the queue. We'll see if we can get to them at the end then.
All right, I will talk fast then. All right, so let's talk national objectives. And as Doug mentioned, if we do an eligible activity with CDBG funds, we also have to have it also has to meet a national objective. So we have that two-pronged test with CDBG. When folks have installed infrastructure into areas to expand where broadband's available, they've often done it under the low mod area national objective. So for that, the area must be primarily residential and at least 51% low mod. One of the best ways to determine that is to use HUD's mapping tool that's available, and we have the link here for the low mod income summary data for all these programs. What this does is it allows you to draw in the service area using various shapes, a rectangle, a polygon, a circle, a point, and allows you to draw in the service area. It immediately snaps it to the next highest census geography, because that's how we get to count. And then you can download the data, the low mod income data, to a CSV, basically an Excel file, and you can do the math yourself of adding up the number of low mod people there, adding up the total number of population, see if you're 51% or more. So it's an extremely handy tool to find, and you'll have the link here when you have access to the presentation. You can also Google low mod income summary data and you'll find it as well. You might want to throw in the word HUD also. So if we're doing things, installing things into a house, excuse me, then we have the low mod housing national objective. So in this case, we're installing cables, fiber optics, wiring, anything permanent to the structure is going to be the low mod housing. It can be done as part of an overall rehab project. And here's something I learned that I did not know before preparing for this. If you're doing substantial rehab on rental housing that has 4 or more units, or on building that has 4 or more units, then you're required to add broadband infrastructure into the units. All right. All right, even more national objectives. So we've got the possibility of low mod clientele. We've been talking about that when Doug mentioned the, we were providing devices to homes that are able to access free Wi-Fi. Talk about example of that in a minute. And Doug mentioned it when making the emergency payments. We're helping a low mod family or low mod household. We get to count that as low mod clientele. If we're doing economic development, then we're looking at the low mod jobs more than likely. It can either be, and let me back up for a second, if we're doing a micro enterprise, which is 5 or fewer employees, including the owner, and the owner is part of a low mod household, then that would count as a low mod clientele. And if we are not doing that, so a larger company or not owned by a low mod household, then our national objective is going to be either job retention or job creation. And the jobs need to be made available to or held by a member of a low mod household. One of the great waivers we got with the CDBG-CV Federal Register notice is that if the annual salary for the job is equal to or less than the low income limit for a 1-person family, then it counts as a low mod job. This is wonderful for any of you that have ever done economic development and know what a hassle it can be to try and get income information out of the employees that for the jobs that were retained or created. Folks often don't want to provide that. Businesses don't really help us sometimes to get it. And so as a result, this makes this implementation and administration of an economic development activity with CV money much easier than with regular CDBG. Okay. So let's talk for a second about just some other ways that we can get some assistance to families on broadband. The FCC has an emergency broadband benefit program. It's eligible for folks that are either making 135% of poverty or less, or have SNAP, Medicaid, SSI, live in assisted housing, participates in one of several tribal specific programs. I didn't have room to put them all. I apologize. Experienced a substantial loss of income since February 29, 2020, or received a Pell Grant or participate in the reduced lunch program. So basically a lot of opportunities for folks to be able to get assistance based on these criteria. And then if we go next, we'll see the benefits. So I would say, unfortunately, it's only up to 1 month service, but folks can at least get a $50 a month discount on broadband, 75 months if they're on tribal lands, and one-time discount of up to $100 for a laptop or tablet. And again, it's only 1 month, but at least it's something. The other program I want to talk about next is the Connect Home USA. And this is a pilot program that was started in 2015 in almost 30 cities to bring broadband to HUD-assisted housing. And we got 37% of HUD-assisted households with children in these communities have gotten internet access through this. And I think we have time. I want to make a confession, and I trust it's going to stay among the 430 people in this session. And that is that I never really thought much about broadband before I was a developer. So I kind of thought it was like electricity. You're building a house, you throw in the wiring, the broadband hooks up to the house, everything's great. Turns out not so much. So as a developer of multifamily rental housing, affordable rental housing, you have to negotiate with the providers. And what you're negotiating for is one of them to install their wiring for free. So you have to do this well in advance of when you start construction. They're going to install the wiring for you. And then they are either going to let you buy it in wholesale and resell it to your tenants at a higher rate, so you'll have some revenue from that, or they will give you money for a small amount of money for every tenant that signs up for service. Now, I was working for a nonprofit developer of affordable housing. 50% of our units were occupied by formerly homeless families. We weren't a real draw for internet service providers. So we had to actually negotiate hard. We had one provider that was willing to do it out of probably about 4 or 5 in the community. And then we had to negotiate with them to get them to install the broadband and be willing to provide us with a little bit of cash for everybody that took up that decided to get a contract with them. So FCC rules won't allow you to have an exclusive rights with somebody, but in effect, it becomes that way because they're the ones that had the wiring. So in theory, another company could have come in and provided internet service to our tenants, but they were going to have to tear open the wall, run all the wiring through it again, and repair the wall. So in effect, we had one option. All right. All right, so let's talk briefly about some program designs, and then we can get back to some of the questions we have. So here's an example of infrastructure. I was talking about my familiarity with West Virginia's programs. So they're using CDBG to expand broadband to underserved areas. An example with McDowell County, a third of the residents have no broadband access. They installed 20 miles of of fiber lines. We're going to serve 300 homes and businesses. The national objective of their meeting was low mod area, because where they were running the lines, where the people were going to have access, folks, more than 51% of the people that live there were low mod. All right. And then here's another one of a low mod clientele in Tucson. And let's face it, nothing says Arizona like a cactus. Am I right? Mm-hmm. So we've got 150,000 households in Tucson that don't have broadband. The city erected towers on fiber connected municipal buildings and city owned property. Then they installed converter devices inside eligible low mod income households. In order to qualify, people had to apply and had to have their income verified. The last data I could find was from mid-February, which said they had installed 300 by then. Their plan was to have 1,000 installed by the end of March. I know we saw somebody from Pima, Arizona, so I don't know if they have any more updated information than I have. And then the city was going to provide the service for free through the end of December 2021. So low mod clientele expanded the access, the reach of their broadband on their municipal buildings and city-owned property, and then gave folks a converter, eligible applicants a converter that allowed them to access it. All right, and I think we're back to Q&A, so we can go back to the questions, Diane, if we've got some.
I just want to say real quick that Arizona example, when people think about the difficulty of private companies and accessing broadband privately, I mean, I think with the towers and connecting it to their own public infrastructure is kind of a great example of one. And again, it's in a city, it's not in a rural area, so it's a lot easier to do. But I think that's just a really great example of how you can make it work and not necessarily have to deal with the installation of private infrastructure. Not that you won't have instances where you want to do that, but I think that is kind of a great example of how that can be done. Okay, sorry, Stan. I just had
No problem.
I was like, actually, I really like that idea.
It is kind of cool, yeah.
Yeah. So anyways, I'm sorry. Diane, we are back to questions.
Great. All right, so we do have a few more questions that hopefully we can get to in the next 7 minutes. One of them, since we are talking infrastructure, we're talking national objectives, is a clarification, more specificity on a question you answered earlier, related to infrastructure development. So the question is, in the situation where we talked about whether CDBG can be used on the development that's owned by a private broadband provider. In this case, the question is, if there's a situation where the intent is to extend services from point A to point D, and then where there's an LMI area-wide need and there's in need of assistance, but in the process, even though they're trying to connect two areas that are eligible, there may be an indirect possible benefit to giving that services to spots along the line, along the middle, that are not LMI. So no direct benefit would satisfy the LMI national objective, but there's a possibility of future indirect benefit that would not satisfy LMI. How should they approach that and maneuver through that?
So I saw that question, and that's from my friend Fumi at the state of Oregon. Hi, Fumi. Nice to have you ask the question. And so it's an it depends answer from my perspective, right? So when you're talking about infrastructure, one, it's whether it's public or private. It sounds like it's private in this case. But if you're talking about a housing activity, if there's already private infrastructure that's been laid, then the connection to the assisted household that is LMI is really what you're qualifying. Even though there's a trunk there that might support a private development or other types of owners who you're not supporting, that's the case with any utility, right? So when you're thinking about water, sewer, or even infrastructure for broadband, what you're really thinking about is if the infrastructure is already there, then you're thinking about the connection between those low LMI households and the infrastructure. If you're developing the infrastructure, then it is a little bit more complicated in terms of like who can connect or how they connect. But it's kind of a case-by-case scenario that you would obviously want to talk to, for example, your HUD field office about, which was my former field office in Fumi's territory. So I think that that's one way to do it, is just think about whether that infrastructure already exists and whether you're connecting through that or whether or not you're actually potentially benefiting other areas. But when you qualify an activity, you have to take all those things into consideration. So Stan, I don't know if you want to add to that. But
no, I think you covered it. Thank you.
Okay. Great. There is a comment in the question and answer about the program with the Department of Health and Human Services. Stan and Doug, I'm not sure if you saw that or if you want to.
Which question?
Is that, it's like, I think the second one's still listed as some other options available beyond just HUD's and CDBG-CV availability. So maybe just attention to
other broadband assistance programs.
Yeah.
Oh, the one that Stan mentioned is the one that I'm aware of. I do think that there are some providers in local areas that do have different benefit programs for people. I know Comcast at one time in my area was offering some support for people in terms of helping them reduce their bills and things like that. But again, that's area by area. Stan, I don't know if you know of anything else.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, so there's a couple that one of our attendees listed. All right, so another question we have is dealing with some of the possible challenges in meeting national objective. For example, if CDBG funds a line extension, but the LMI household still may not actually have ability to access it, whether they can't afford it, they don't have a home computer, they could have other limitations to that. Is this a consideration when we're talking about LMA compliance?
Well, remember, again, if it's a housing activity, remember that it's defined by HUD now in terms of how you do broadband access for housing. So the infrastructure and the kinds of things that are mentioned in that definition are eligible. So when it comes to personal equipment for an individual, that's a little bit different. But connectivity, if it's a low and moderate income development of some kind, right, and qualifies under a national objective, that connectivity from the line to that particular building, it can be part of an eligible activity. So that's described in the slides, but again, the devil's in the details, but there are ways to make that connectivity possible for people. Whether they buy the smart TV or whether they buy the laptop or have access to one is another story, but the connectivity to the building can be there. And there may be other ways to subsidize the use of the personal equipment. Again, there's lots of programs out there that we're probably not even aware of, even from tech companies that provide discounts of one kind or another for folks.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I have at least two more questions I'm hoping we can squeeze in here. One is somewhat straightforward. If a grantee, and this is related to comp plan, just some technical elements, if a grantee did not address broadband in their most recent comp plan, which includes their annual action plan substantial amendment for CARES Act, can they still use CDBG-CV for broadband?
So my generic answer is that your comp plan has a needs assessment, it has a housing needs assessment, and a community development needs assessment are two components of the comp plan. So the question just kind of becomes, are you linking back to types of needs that you're identifying in your comp plan? If it isn't broadband specific, the question is, are there other types of needs that you're identifying that you can connect an activity to? The goal is to try to connect your consolidated plan to the activities that you actually put in your action plan each year, whether it's 3 or 5 years, and you can update your comp plan to include broadband the next time you do it. But my question, back would be, can you connect it in some way with respect to these activities, and is either as part of your housing needs assessment or your non-housing community development needs assessment?
And then if you're adding an activity, you could amend your plan just following your citizen participation plan requirements, right?
You could.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
That's right.
Good point.
That's right. Thank you, guys. I have one last question I want to squeeze in. It's very practical on the home basis for when we're really talking about the people we're serving with this. So if we're funding lines that are connecting them to a private internet service provider and the grantee leases the lines to that internet service provider, how do we address affordability to the end users? And that may be a little bit beyond us, but to the extent that you guys have experience or advice about that, I think that'd be appreciated.
Well, I think Doug's advice, negotiation. You're going to have to figure out how you're going to, what the leasing amount is, whether or not you're going to charge a lease, whether you're going to let them provide the service and have them commit to a lower price than they offer otherwise when they didn't have to pay for the infrastructure. I'll let you go, Doug, because we're a minute over.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I mean, you know, operating expenses for low moderate income households are really, really difficult. And actually, when you're doing your pro forma, my advice when you're doing the underwriting is you've got to account for all of those costs, and you got to make sure that you have subsidies or other things that help you make it through in terms of operating expenses and other things, services and other things related to low moderate income or supportive housing. We often underfund these types of projects for those kinds of things. When you do your pro forma, make sure you build it in like a developer would who is doing it privately. Don't scrimp and scrape because you have limited resources. Make sure you've got that built in there.
All right, I think LRG is going to kick us off in a second.
Yep,
okay.
That'll be our last question.
Okay, thank you so much. This was great. I mean, I love the back and forth. I love the questions that you asked. I know this is a hot topic, and I know there's a lot of discussion about broadband becoming part of potentially another program that might be HUD supported in the future. So we thank you very much for your participation and the great questions, and we hope you learned something. And again, the slides will be coming to you later. So thanks again for your time, and everybody take care.
All right.